Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Tom Daly. I'm a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and the script asked me to describe my day job, so I'll try to keep it succinct. I'm the local area developer for Zoop Restaurants and our newest concept, Tasty Dog, which we're building out now. I'm chair of the board of the Tom Daly Foundation, who's the sponsor of today's events and does a lot of work in the rail heritage environment. And then I'm chair emeritus at COSI as well. So I want to welcome our in-person audience today. It's great to see so many faces. I'd like to say hello to those of you who are tuning in on the live stream. Hello, everyone on the live stream. The Metro Club live streaming is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. Thank you very much to our live streaming partners. We'd also like to thank those of you who purchased a virtual seat for today's forum. We are very grateful for your support. You can learn more about CMC, register for our events, join or renew your membership, purchase a virtual seat, or make a donation anytime at columbusmetroclub.org. Today's forum is sponsored by the Tom E. Daly Foundation, and that's because I and our foundation members are very passionate about rail transportation. We have one of our board members here today, Todd Kleismet, and Tony Bell might be here somewhere as well, who's also on our board. I appreciate them being here. It's also sponsored by the Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Forum, Revisiting Columbus History, and by Columbus Landmarks, who are participating as partners. Won't you please help me thank all of the sponsors for today? Rail is among the fastest, most energy efficient, sustainable, and affordable means of transportation on the planet. There was a time in the United States when rail was the best and often the only way to travel. In many places around the world, it still is. But today, with few exceptions, and Ohio in particular, it's almost impossible to travel by rail or inconvenient. Recent news suggests that Ohioans might once again be able to ride the rails as a transportation option. We're going to review a rich past with Ohio's rail history with a look into the future in today's forum entitled Rails and Transit, Past and Future. Please welcome our panelists, Director of Transportation and Infrastructure at MORPC, Thea Walsh Ewing. The co-author of Amtrak, America's Railroad, Transportation's Orphan and Its Struggle for Survival, which is coming out in October, and the owner of Benjamin D. Rickey and Company, Jeff Darbee. Thank you. Senior Manager of Government Affairs for State and Legislative Relations at Amtrak, Derek James. And our host for today, journalist, Ohio State House News Bureau, Andy Chow. And Jeff will start things off with a short history of passenger rail in Ohio, and then Andy will lead the conversation. Jeff, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I thought I'd start with a little historical context. I am a rail fan. I am an architectural historian as well as a rail historian. As a rail fan, I like to count myself as not being one of the sort of subset of rail fans that are known as foamers, the ones who are more intense than others. I have a serious interest in railroads, railroad history. Railroads, it can be said and has been said, and it's really true, it's axiomatic even, that railroads built the United States, there's no question. It's because they were in a transportation monopoly for pretty much all of the 19th century and even getting into the 20th century, and there weren't any other options. And that helped lead to what became the downfall of passenger rail. When it was the only way to get around, passenger rail was part of the railroad's business. And it remained profitable generally until about 1920 or so. And from that point on, a combination of the cost of equipment, the cost of maintaining stations and passenger facilities, paying the crews and so on, began to eat into revenues. But the railroads generally made enough on the freight side of the traffic that they were willing to run the passenger trains largely as a public service, but it still was considered a business. Jump to the period after World War II. Just as the railroads built the country, the railroads won World War II for the Allies, the American railroads in particular. They carried 97% of wartime freight traffic and 90% of wartime passenger traffic. The tremendous traffic during World War II brought new profits that the railroads had not enjoyed for many years. Working through the Depression, many went bankrupt. And it appeared to the railroads, and in retrospect it was a misjudgment, of course, that there was a revival of rail passenger traffic. So following the war, in part because equipment had pretty much been worn out by the heavy war traffic, but also because the railroads saw a new era in passenger travel, they began ordering new rolling stock, new engines, new cars. Sure. New engines and new cars. A total of about 3,000 new passenger cars were ordered by the various railroads that had passenger service across the country. The New York Central Railroad alone ordered over 700. And that fleet was what became the core of the Amtrak fleet in 1971. What happened following the war, there was indeed a surge in traffic during the war, but almost as soon as the new equipment was beginning to arrive, competition began to appear. There had been automobiles for some time, there had been air travel for some time, but it was after World War II that these two other transportation modes really began to take off. People enjoyed the convenience and the privacy of the automobile, the speed of the aircraft, the airplanes, the air service, and these became serious competition to the rail passenger service, to the point that by the 1960s the railroads really were in trouble. And it became more and more apparent that something had to be done. The answer was to create a quasi-public corporation, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, the job of which was to take over the passenger service across the country and relieve the railroads of the burden. And it's important to note several things. One is that Amtrak, in its original form, came with a lot of baggage, and I don't mean suitcases. The baggage consisted of the myth that it would be a profitable corporation and that it was created to preserve rail passenger service. In fact, it was created to help keep the railroads from going bankrupt. The founders of Amtrak really expected it to last only 2 or 3 years and then to sort of peter out and the trains would just disappear. The problem is it forgot to die. And Ohio has benefited from having both the railroad passenger service in the pre-Amtrak days, but also Amtrak service as well. It wasn't always easy. In the early days, people weren't sure they wanted railroads. One Ohio city, unnamed by the author of the book I read, said that if God had designed that his intelligent creatures should travel at a frightful rate of 15 miles an hour by steam, he would have told it through his holy pamphlet, by which I think he means the Bible. It is a device of Satan to lead immortal souls down to hell. Now, I did ride on Penn Central quite a bit in the old days, and it wasn't quite hellish, but it wasn't all that great either. And I guess since it wasn't in the Bible, railroads never should have existed. If we can have the slides come up, I'd appreciate it. The first one is, and I should say here that my computer and graphics skills are not fully developed yet. So my slides are going to look like a 4th grade project prepared the night before it was due, but I hope it communicates information. In 1949, the colored lines you see on this map, a railroad map of Columbus, shows the lines with passenger service going through Union Station. Almost 50 trains a day came through Columbus, eastbound, westbound, northbound, southbound. 20 trips alone on the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is the line that goes east-west across the city. That was the busiest, 10 trains a day in each direction. Next busiest was on what was the New York Central to Cleveland and Cincinnati, 5 round trips a day on those routes. So by the post-war period, Columbus was very well served by the private railroad companies. Go to the next slide then, and it shows what was happening in 1970. The trains had largely evaporated. And Amtrak came along early in 1971, May 1st, 1971, and by the time it came along, Those other services were eliminated. The next one up is April 30th, 71, when this shows what was surviving as of that date. Much of the passenger service in the country had been eliminated, but there were still several hundred trains that were operating. The next day, May 1st, 71, about 2/3 of those trains were gone. And the next slide following the May 1st slide shows Amtrak's first timetable, the routes Amtrak served as of May 1st, 71. And you'll notice Columbus is not on that map. So from 71 to 79, we had one train operated by Amtrak between New York City and Kansas City through St. Louis. And that lasted till 1979, was eliminated in what are called the Carter cutbacks. And then the final slide is a slide of the Amtrak system as it is today. And I hope you can read it all right. So the important things to remember was the railroad's passenger service used to be a business. Amtrak does not run as a business. It should be thought of as a government service. And for that reason, it shouldn't be thought of as a profit-making entity. It had to be promised as profit-making in order to get a signature by Richard Nixon to even create Amtrak in the first place. But anybody in the railroad business knew it wouldn't be profitable. As one of the Amtrak's presidents said, they weren't profitable prior to Amtrak starting. Why would they be profitable afterwards? But it is a government service. It should be run in a business-like manner in providing that service, but it should not be considered a for-profit corporation. In addition, the investments in highways and airlines have always been viewed as investments, but Amtrak has always been viewed as an expense. And we've got to get around that as well. It's an investment in the third leg of the transportation triad in the United States, highway and air and rail. And if we can get past those barriers and that baggage Amtrak has had to carry for 50 years, I think we can make some progress. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for being here and for watching the live stream or listening to this later. Again, my name's Andy Chow. I'm a State House correspondent with Ohio Public Radio and Television State House News Bureau. It's good to be with all of you. After a year in quarantine with my kids, I need to keep reminding myself we're not talking about Thomas the Tank Engine. We're talking about real trains, real rails. And Jeff just really explained in great depth the history of rail here in Ohio. Derek, I want to go to you now because I know that there was an announcement made yesterday. There's some news coming out about the possible future of rail in Ohio. Where does passenger rail, where does it stand as of now in Ohio?
Oh, thank you very much. Glad to be with you. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm not here alone. I bring greetings, if you will, from Amtrak CEO Bill Flynn and our president Stephen Gardner, who actually were meeting with Ohio mayors yesterday in a video roundtable to discuss some of our proposals for expansion. Make sure to Google us and you'll probably see some of those stories if you haven't already. There was some coverage in the Plain Dealer as well as the Post-Dispatch here. I'm also joined by one of our board members, Mr. Tom Carper, is a member of the Amtrak Board of Directors. Our Board of Directors is appointed by the President of the United States with the advice and consent of the Senate. And he's a former mayor of a community in Illinois and as such is very engaged and is glad to join me here today. In answer to your question, and thank you very much, Jeff, for setting a great stage for where we are today. The challenge of Amtrak has been just that we have several, let's say, constituencies. And one of those constituencies is the Congress, and what their vision is for us changes depending on who's in office. So are we to act like a business or are we to act like a public service? So the slingshot back and forth is a challenge for the organization when we're trying to deliver a package of services to the traveling public. Fortunately, after the first several decades of that slingshot back and forth, I think over the last couple of decades, we've really moved the needle. We've really got on track in terms of delivering a product for the consumer that the consumer will ride, that has a high quality of service, and our ridership has really reflected that. Prior to the pandemic, the last fiscal year, 2019, we carried 32.5 million customers, which was more customers than we had ever carried, twice as many as in our first year, and the system map looked pretty much the same. That level of revenue and ridership allowed us to reduce our operating losses, increase revenue, of course, and gives us a credibility with Congress such that today Because of what we've been able to do across the system and showing that the public will ride trains, we are going to the Congress and we are asking them to provide us with the resources to dramatically increase the level of passenger train service in the United States, especially in corridors where we think passenger rail can be very competitive between major cities of 100 to 400 miles from each other. Why? Why we just happen to be in one of those places in the state of Ohio with important cities throughout the state that we think passenger rail can meet a travel need for the consumer.
All right, great. Can you? I want to talk more about that, but let's get Thea in this. First of all, just what are your thoughts on that announcement, and what makes Columbus and the state of Ohio such an appealing location to have a project like that come here?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for your remarks, James and Jeff. So, wow, we are really prepared for a connection to other cities. As the key official who helps plan for Central Ohio, I work with people every 4 years to fully overlook the transportation planning for our region. And every time we do an update, there's an outcry from our citizens in this region and beyond that would like to see some sort of inner city passenger service in Central Ohio and in broadly, even beyond that, in Ohio. So we definitely have the will. But we also have a growing region. We're going to be growing to a million more people, to 3 million people by the year 2050, as we've cited in our Insight 2050 study. And then the corridor, which we've studied both the 3C corridor, which is that Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland corridor, as well as a connection from Chicago through Columbus on to Pittsburgh. And on that Chicago to Pittsburgh line, they're going to grow 3 million more people on that line. So the ridership is there to support a rail service in Central Ohio and what I would almost call the central band of Ohio. It's not just about that 3C corridor, but creating a rail hub in Columbus. We are ready to have that opportunity here.
Derek, what does this look like? What?
Thank you.
It's like the State of the Union where we just have to give it a second. What exactly are we looking at when we talk about the 3C? And I was also hearing yesterday the 3C and D for Dayton.
Yes.
That corridor, what does that look like? Is that a straight shot from one city to another? Would there be stops along the way, or is that still something that's up in the air?
The model that works for passenger rail, and it's demonstrated in other corridors where we've been able to do this around the country, is multiple trains throughout the day, morning, afternoon, and evening departures. So you as a consumer, when you're making a travel decision, your schedule doesn't always fit the schedule of either our train schedules today or of other carriers. So you're making decisions based on when you need to be someplace. So we will be most successful if we're operating several trains throughout the day, and that's what we're proposing for initially the 3C and the D corridor. So if you're here in Columbus and you've got a meeting late morning or early afternoon in Cleveland, you can walk over to the depot. We presume it'll hopefully be downtown Columbus, maybe even underneath the convention center. Get on the train, get some work done on Wi-Fi, catch a little nap because you stayed up the night before, get to Cleveland, conduct your business, walk to the Gund Arena, or I hope that's what it's still called.
Quickens now, but still the cabs are there.
Okay, yep. And then be back the same day. We think it's critical, we think for mobility, that there are communities that are of size in between the 3Cs and the D. We got a very fantastic reception from the citizens of Gallion a few weeks ago who were excited. Crestline. Yes, suburban Gallion. from the citizens of Crestline a few weeks ago because we have targeted them as a location for a station. We're also looking at Delaware, which is a growing part of your region, as well as Sharonville and Springfield. You've got many universities along this route, and we know that families who are just sort of getting started, sending their first kid to college, they don't need to have the cost of a 2,000-pound vehicle to go on top of the tuition to get their kid to and from college. Having a good train service is good for them too.
Jeff, I imagine that if someone who might be newer to the Columbus region would hear about the potential plans for a train coming through here, they might say, how could that work? That could never work. What does our history say about the potential for such a big project coming back to Columbus and coming back to Ohio?
Part of it is looking what available infrastructure there is. For example, there's pretty good track between Cleveland, Columbus, and by way of Delaware, over to Dayton and down to Cincinnati. And the quality of the track is fairly high, although it's largely single track, which limits capacity. Part of the issue is working with the freight railroads to integrate passenger and freight traffic, because freight trains are so much slower. So you need what's called much more track capacity, the length of piece of track you have for accommodating trains on given schedules. That's part of the issue. And part of what has to be done is helping the freight railroads make investments that enable improvement in the flow of traffic, that they can accommodate passenger trains without significantly affecting their freight traffic. That's part of it. For example, Columbus to Pittsburgh there's a track there, but it's not a very fast track. It's the former Ohio Central, Columbus and Ohio River. Now it's a regional freight railroad. And it's down to single track as well. It used to be double track because that was that route that went through Columbus east to west between New York and St. Louis. So part of the history is what's happened to the railroads that we had, and what's their physical condition, and what are the upgrades that are needed from a physical standpoint. Part of it too is we don't have a very strong history of supporting rail in Ohio. You may remember not that long ago we had $400 million from the feds to start the 3C service, awarded during the Strickland administration, and as soon as Governor Casey came in, he gave it back, and other states were happy to get it, but we didn't get our trains. So one question I would have is that history not interested in passenger trains? Do you have evidence, Derek or Thea, that that's changed at the political level?
Thea, if you'll allow me. The Amtrak vision plan acknowledges that. A couple of things. Firstly, you touched on the freight infrastructure. We're very fortunate in the United States to have a very robust shareholder-owned freight railroad network. And our system wouldn't be as successful as it is without that network. We rely on their tracks and their dispatching services. We also acknowledge that their network is very critical to the economy of our regions. So we don't want to impinge upon their ability to provide service to their commercial customers, and so should we be provided the resources that we think are appropriate from Congress to get this system up and running, we will begin discussions with the host railroads over whose tracks we need to run to actually figure out what investments need to be made so that not only can the passenger trains run quickly and on time, but they can still continue to serve their freight customers. To your second point, our vision also acknowledges that the regime that exists now for expanding passenger trains in America is a federal government funding the states sort of regime, and every state's ability or willingness to fund transit and rail is not the same. One state could be very much in favor of providing robust passenger rail system and go after all the federal grants that are out there, but the American economy doesn't stop at state lines, so it's difficult to develop a robust interstate network when you don't have all the states playing together nicely. So what we're proposing is Congress has created us and we have expertise in being able to go and set up passenger train systems. Provide us with the dollars. We will go in, fund the upfront capital to get the service up and running, set up routes that we think would be very commercially viable, and if after 5 years there is some small operating support that might be needed from the state, the expectation is that the service will have proven itself based upon the investments and based upon great public response, that the state will look at the value proposition and say, yeah, it may require a little bit of a subsidy to keep the trains going, but the economic benefits that are accruing to Crestline and Springfield and Columbus and Cincinnati are more than worth it. the same value proposition that's made when we use taxpayer dollars to widen I-71, because the last time I looked, that's not profitable either.
And that's a good point. Yeah, right. Government, yeah,
Thea,
the United
what
States
are-
Marines aren't profitable either, and the CDC isn't profitable, so.
Yeah. So I wanted to address the freight rail part of this question, and that is, as the planning agency here for Central Ohio, we recognize that freight railroad is a lifeblood of this state, and that we need to keep that going. And as part of our planning is to ensure that we can in fact do that and also help create these opportunities. So as we work on the plans with Amtrak, with the state of Ohio, the goal is to have that table where we can have these discussions with the freight rail providers, help them solve some of the problems they're having. They're having those problems before before passenger rail even comes into the picture. There are needed improvements that need to happen now just for their business. So let's actually have an open conversation about what infrastructure needs we need to meet, not only for our economy, but for our citizens too.
Theo, staying on you, what are the challenges from state government, from maybe local government that either stand in the way, or what is the climate here? Is there a lot of support behind a plan like this?
Well, I would think the biggest challenge is really obvious, and that is that rail is a private industry. And so therefore they fund their infrastructure, very unlike many of the other types like trucking or even to some degree air. So bringing them to the table and ensuring that they have a partner in your local government and the state government that is looking at this as a piece of our economy in Ohio, as opposed to just another business doing business here. And so how we're gonna make that work together. So I think that's the key. And, public-private partnership is very much a part of successful projects, whether they're roadway projects, rail projects, trail projects. I mean, this has got to be part of the lingo that we bring to this conversation, and both sides of the table have to be talking about it. And I will say that is definitely part of the challenge, is getting both parties to the table to really have an open discussion about the use of this infrastructure.
And well, Derek, I want to get your take, but I also want, when you do answer this, we're talking about elected officials, government leaders, but can you also talk about just general public buy-in? How important is it for the general public to want something like this and to speak out in favor of something like this?
Oh, I think buy-in from the general public is incredibly critical. I think through the first several decades of our life at Amtrak, when it was an unknown question whether or not we would survive, that passenger trains would continue to exist in America, it was the actual general public that spoke up and said, no, trains are important to us. Trains are important to our communities. They're important to our mobility. And that's what got us through. And the success that we have seen is because of the support from the public. So as I tell my colleagues when I'm on the train and they ask me, what do you do for Amtrak? And I say government affairs, and they don't always know, no, I don't set up affairs for government officials. I remind them that once I do explain what I do, their role in government affairs is really critical, because they're serving our customers, and our customers are voters, and they let elected officials know, don't you mess with my train, I want more trains. And that's the reception that we're getting as we go around the state, as not even just Ohio, but around the country, and our plan is getting so much excitement. If you could, I have a slide that, I have two slides, one that presents the entire vision plan for Amtrak of the United States. So that would be a great one to put up at this point. And that touches on Thea's comment about the bringing the freight railroads to the table. This is not rocket science. This is already happening. Amtrak, the state of Virginia, and CSX Company, who is one of the railroads that we would need to use here for the 3C and D corridor, are engaged in a multi-billion-dollar deal to upgrade CSX right-of-way so that the frequent service on the Northeast corridor from New York to Washington can extend down into Virginia to Richmond, Norfolk, and Roanoke, and tie the Virginia economy into the juggernaut of the Northeast economy along the Acela corridor. And the railroads are at the table working with us to do that.
What's the price tag that comes with something like that? And is that going to be a challenge when it comes to hopefully or possibly getting state elected officials on board for something like this?
Again, what we're proposing at Amtrak is Congress step up to the plate. Over the last 10 years, for years I would get the reference from opposition that, well, highway users pay for it with gas taxes. Well, the Highway Trust Fund has been, I don't know if the word is bankrupt, but the Congress has had to move $157 billion of general fund dollars into the Highway Trust Fund over the last decade. So to me, that's a subsidy for cars. So we're asking for a lot less than that. For our 15-year plan to build out the network, which might show on the map, I'm not sure, I can't see what you guys are saying, that 15-year plan is $75 billion to build out a network that would give passenger rail service to 160 new cities on more than 30 new routes and provide trips for 20 million more customers. So there's your price tag.
Perspective, Williston, North Dakota, which is served by Amtrak, has a new $200 million airport with 4 flights a day.
And the Amtrak station, I think, serves more people with the 2 trains a day.
Yeah.
So, and there are a lot of places like that where folks don't realize how critical passenger rail service is to the smaller communities where Amtrak really does play a significant role. We're lucky in the big cities because we've got air service, but we have lots of places in the country that don't have that luxury.
For our book, we interviewed several mayors from smaller communities, and to a mayor, they said, yes, we need this Amtrak service. It might only be 9 or 10 people a day, but over a year, that's 3,000 people.
And Jeff, I was going to ask, so like you said, you have a book coming out, you wrote the book on this, you've done a lot of research. What is the current engagement from the general public? Is there a lot of interest in something like this from just the average Ohioan, the average American?
Yeah, I think there is. There's a lot of confusion on the part of the public about conventional versus high-speed rail. And high-speed rail it's kind of almost a pejorative these days. There are issues with the one in California. The one in Texas seems to be moving forward, but is not actually under construction yet. People look at European high-speed rail, which really is, and say, gee, is it worth spending money just to go that much faster? There's a lot of confusion, and what we're talking about here is what we call conventional rail. Although conventional, just on most routes, is almost 80 miles an hour. There are some Amtrak routes that are already upgraded to 110, beginning to approach the high-speed category. The Acela service, I think, is authorized for what, 125 an hour?
150.
Okay. So we're getting there step by step, but there's a lot of confusion and kind of opposition to this whole high-speed rail idea, particularly from a lot of politicians. So that's one of the humps you have to overcome. And then there's that whole question of why do we have to subsidize people riding passenger trains? Well, for the same reason you subsidize people riding in airplanes or cars, but people don't make that connection. Trains have always been considered something different because of that private nature of the railroads themselves. And it's a hard thing to overcome.
Well, I just want to add one more piece, sorry, on the cost piece. So a 4-lane segment of just flat interstate highway, you're looking at least $30 to $50 million a mile. So when you consider that in their request and how many miles of that we have across the United States, we subsidize transportation on every level. And I could say, and I mean, maybe there is one out there, but I don't think there's a transportation business out there that is profitable without a subsidy. And I'm not saying that because I'm saying we need subsidies. I'm just saying that everything is subsidized by our federal dollars for transportation. And now it's just about the choice of what we have. And that choice is a part of access, and access is equity. Those options create options for employment, education, and ways just to relax, honestly, too, for people who are going to need a break after this pandemic.
We're gonna move on to questions from our in-person and live stream audience in just a few minutes. So if you want to start making your way over to the microphone or to the keyboard, I don't know how you enter it, but so that'll be coming up. But first, let me ask a question before we send it to the audience. Thea, you just mentioned equity, and what I'm also wondering here is economic development, and Derek, you kind of touched on this too. What kind of jobs could be coming to Ohio because of a project like we're talking about?
Well,
Well, I can talk a little bit about just what we know before the rail, right? So the study we just completed, the Rapid Speed Transportation Initiative, which actually looks at that Chicago to Pittsburgh line, we are anticipating a significant increase in jobs from 24% all the way to 12%, depending on which city you're talking about on that corridor over that period of time out to 2040. From here to 2040. So that already is there. That is pent up demand for users right there. And that adds to the number of population that line's going to potentially have. And then of course, those are representative of cities in Ohio and Indiana, but extrapolate that as you will, that's also some increases in Ohio that we're going to see even on the 3C line in employment. And it's interestingly enough, employment goes up in places where population isn't necessarily, which means those people have to get there. So that's another factor, is creating those options for people to get to those jobs.
Well, there's also a phenomenon called transportation-oriented development, where around rail transportation nodes in particular, that you don't find so much with airports because of how much ground they need and barriers and so on, and you don't find it with highways as much. But, for example, Princeton Junction, New Jersey used to be a wilderness where there was a line that went into Princeton on the main northeast corridor. It's almost a city now, and it tends to trigger economic development. The Brightline project in Florida, for example, is privately constructed passenger rail, but it's not a passenger rail system. It's an economic development, real estate development project is what it is.
Yeah, we have to remember that, and please cut me off when you need to. Let's remember that what we're talking about is increasing transportation access. We're increasing network fluidity and capacity. So we're allowing more people to move places without necessarily doing so by polluting the environment or adding lanes to the freeway. We have examples all over our system where we provide frequent service that businesses and consumers are making locational decisions based upon the presence of good quality train service. We have a town in Illinois called Normal, population 50,000. There's a university there, and the community invested, I think, $50 million in a new train station, and it led to more than $250 million of private sector investment right around the station. So those are jobs on construction, those are jobs in hospitality, and that is making that place a more appealing place to do business, because we do a lot of business for those headquarters in that town, State Farm, country companies, getting to Chicago to meet and do business and have business services. So people are riding back and forth on those 10 trains a day. So.
It's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Jane Scott of CMC is curating questions from the live stream audience. And for our live audience, please keep your questions brief and to the point. So I think Jane will be up with the first live stream question.
I do, and we're going to be doing kind of every other one, so I'll try to make sure everybody gets a chance. I have a lot of questions. I'm going to combine one here. Jill Levy, what will be the positive and negative effects on the environment when travel by train is expanded? And along with that, Chris Cloth, how has rail transportation technology evolved since the days of those stinky, smoky diesel trains? Will we continue to poison poor people who live near the railroad? So it's kind of an environmental question.
Sure. I think I can answer that. We're in the process right now of purchasing a new fleet of locomotives that meet Tier 4 emissions. There's something like 90% less emissions for particulate matter, and they're more fuel efficient. Many of our trains, though, are actually electric propulsion. I'd say a third of our business is along the Northeast Corridor, where the trains are powered by electric propulsion, so zero emissions from the trains. And let's also remember that a passenger that moves from a car to a train is already less emissions right there. So.
We were on a forum with the mayors in Ohio last night, and I heard Bill Flynn say that actually traveling on the Amtrak is 83% more efficient than driving, and 73% more efficient than flying. So those are the carbon emissions and the impact on air quality improvements over those other modes.
Okay, next question.
I'm Judy Box. I grew up in Australia and have spent a lot of time in Europe, where train is just the way to do it. I don't see us prying Americans out of their cars quite so easily. For example, in Australia, you take the train to Victoria Station. There's a tram that takes you to King Street. I don't know how we anticipate people are going to be able to move once they get to a destination.
Well, I think that is a really good reflection on the American motorist and trying to change that behavior. And so one of the things that actually came up during the funding of the 3C passenger line last time was the time it takes and this concern that this is going to be the slow train. But I'm going to tell you now that the way that you're moving on the road today, that time that you take to go someplace is going to go higher and higher over time because we are literally built out on our roadway system. So this is an opportunity to create additional capacity, not only on our roadway system, but also offer up another mode and another option for people in the United States. And then if this last year hasn't told us anything about behavior change, boy, it was a master class in it. And so I think it's all about how we frame that. How do we frame that behavior change for the American public and the need to change?
And I question the assertion about Americans won't ride trains. Americans don't have some special DNA. I can remember when I started in this industry, the argument that I would get is just people in the Northeast will ride trains. Like Californians won't ride trains because they love their cars. Our second busiest corridor is now in California. Whether or not people will ride trains is if you provide them with a convenient service. And when the service is there, it will drive walkable, dense real estate development that allows things like the last mile to be by a taxi or by walking. I mean, I look at my hometown, not necessarily totally representative, but a Midwestern city. Our train station downtown is busier than our second airport, and most of the people access the trains by walking to the train because the real estate development around that station is so valuable that businesses are making relocation decisions to locate themselves within walking distance of the train station.
And if I could ask go ahead.
I just want to add one little thing. And Ohio is more dense than Illinois or California as a state.
And could I have you do a quick follow-up, Thea? So if this project were to come to Ohio, were to come to Columbus, would that mean big changes for something like CODA as well to build out an infrastructure for intercity or inner-city transportation?
CODA, the city of Columbus, and our region is prepared. They're working on a Link Us proposal and projects to connect multiple corridors in this city so that when people do step off of an inner city service such as rail, that they will have a way around this town. Because frankly, that's one of the factors that would inhibit a good service or good travel experience for our public.
Jane?
Sorry, it keeps moving. Doug Talbot, how much funding is expected to come from Ohio State and local government to complete this, and is it a phased-in approach?
Amtrak's vision is that for the first 3 years, no funding would be needed from the state of Ohio. At year 3, we would look at a phased approach of contributions from the state if operating support is necessary to keep the service going.
Just jumping back to when we had the $400 million but didn't accept it, the estimate was that it would take about $17 million a year to support the 3C service on the part of the state. If you divide that into the $2 billion we're spending on the downtown Spaghetti Bowl Highway, that would have run that 3C service for 77 years.
My name is Franklin Conaway. I'm lead consultant and project coordinator for the Columbus Street Railway Company, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing modern streetcars to Center City, Columbus as soon as possible. Also a rail advocate. I believe that all of us would agree that Center City density is very important to the success of intercity rail. My question to you relating to streetcars and intercity rail is how important do you think it could be to have a modern, to intercity rail to have a modern streetcar system operating in Center City, Columbus and efficiently linked to intercity rail?
Well, I think I spoke for transit in our region whenever I said that we were working on the Link Us program with CODA and the city of Columbus. And I'm pretty much agnostic when it comes to what we need actually on the streets here in order to make that happen. But our city buses are no longer cutting it. We are considering things like light rail and bus rapid transit and, of course, streetcars as part of the solutions as we look at each of the corridors and their needs and how they will grow over the period of years after that development. So each one is being looked at and that's specialized to what our needs in that part of our region is going to be. So streetcars could very well be a part of it.
One reason that TOD, transit or transportation-oriented development, happens is because the rail, whether it's streetcar rail or intercity or regional, that's fixed in place. It's a fixed guideway, as it's called. Buses can move away onto different routes, but you know the rail is going to be there. So investors feel comfortable investing in an area where rail exists, and they know it's not going to go away.
Well, bus rapid transit system is pretty engaged now too, and the level of infrastructure that just has to be built for the platform and other pieces of it are, I know the rail used to be a symbol of that, but bus rapid transit is very much that way today
Once
because
you
the
get
investment has to be
substantial
made.
investment in place, the more you put into it, the less likely you're going to walk away from it. It's not
Yeah,
the same as just
and-
changing streets.
That's what we're planning here in Columbus.
Jane?
Great. Aaron Shank and a couple of other people have asked this question. Apparently, the dispatch this morning said something about a 5-hour trip to Cleveland. And I know, Thea, you commented that driving by car is going to get farther and farther. But the question that Aaron has, couldn't we have a few of the higher speed routes for morning and evening commuters along with those that are sort of like an express lane for Amtrak as opposed to stopping all along the local?
I guess I'll address that. We are only limited in speed by our willingness to invest dollars, all right? So there is a balance that one must strike between what we're willing to invest versus what the benefits we expect to get from it. We do anticipate a trip time that would be slightly longer than maybe driving the car from end to end or between intermediate points. But as we have discovered in our network around the country, as long as you are close to driving, as long as you are close to drive time and you provide people with with multiple frequencies throughout the day, the train wins. Because when you're on the train, you're working, you're sleeping, you're having a beverage that you shouldn't be drinking while you're driving. Whereas when you're driving, you're just driving. So we, again, find some of our most successful corridors, like Chicago to Milwaukee, takes about the same amount of time as driving, but we've had to keep adding cars, and we're trying to add trains, and that route almost covers its operating costs because the consumers are deciding it's much more convenient for me to walk to the train station from my meeting and then get on a train and get some work done or get some sleep after the end of a busy day than actually trying to get behind the wheel of a car.
Derek, the proposal that's on the table right now compared to the proposal that was denied by former Governor John Kasich 10 years ago, is it faster than the old one?
It is faster.
Yeah.
Many of us were here during all of that, so we know that speed is important. We know that the narrative is important. And so we are proposing to invest enough in the host railroad so that we can get the speed up. Next week I'm going to be riding a train in Michigan that's going to be we're going to increase to 110 miles per hour. I'm not saying we're going to start with that here, but we're certainly going to investigate on how we get to the next steps to make it go even faster.
Well, if you want to get Ohio competitive, just mention Michigan. So, Stu?
On the mayor's call last night, on the forum that they held yesterday, Bill Flynn made a good point too that I want to add here to what Derek said, and that is that it's not just about the time from point A to point B, but all the points in between. And there were several competitive segments on that corridor as well, in addition to the long distance. So I do feel like that was something that he made sure that Ohioans heard as part of his message. And then the last piece is about the relaxing time on a train. I think as we've transitioned in the pandemic to these more hybrid type work environments, now I'm in the middle of actually transitioning back into the office right now, but I'm competing for meeting time whenever I used to not have to do travel time in that. And so the idea that, if I'm traveling, that time can still be used on meetings is part of that shift we may see that actually started out of this period of time. And that's why this may be more unique time to start this venture than it was 10 years ago.
Okay, Stu, for the last question.
Thanks, Andy. First, thanks to Jeff and Thea and Derek. You're all friends of mine, of course, but we appreciate you being on the panel today. My question actually is this: we're becoming more familiar with what Amtrak's proposal is right now for 3 trains a day to start in the 3C and D corridor and expanded service to other corridors in Ohio. But and maybe Derek's the best to answer this, is to give us an idea of what you've seen happen in similar corridors from their startup phase to where they are today.
Sure. I actually took a look at some of the corridors because I always expect people to ask me what the fare is going to be. So let's take, for instance, a similar corridor would be Seattle, Vancouver, BC to Seattle, Portland, and Eugene, Oregon. I think that's about 280 miles. You've got some good mid-sized cities along the corridor. I can remember when I started at Amtrak in the late 1990s, we had just introduced these new European trains on that particular corridor. And in the year before we introduced those trains and added that service, 47,000 people rode between those cities. In the last year before the pandemic, the ridership on that corridor, with the addition of additional trains, and I think there's now 4 or 5 trains a day coursing back and forth, now we have 800,000 people riding that corridor. So there are multiple trains throughout the day. The train is now the preferred means. We beat the plane in terms of the number of people that we carry and in terms of the time moving up and down that corridor. So there's an example.
So what will the fare be?
Wait.
We all want to know.
I wrote it down. Let's say, okay, Chicago to Detroit. Oh, there's Michigan again. During pre-pandemic times, we operate 3 trains a day. We're actually increasing the speeds on that corridor next Tuesday. Coach fare can be between $40 and $96, business class $125. We yield manage like the planes do. So when there's lots of demand, we charge more. When there's, like on a Tuesday in February, the fare isn't so great because not that many people are moving. And the goal in our partnership with the state of Michigan is to reduce the operating support that's necessary from the taxpayers. And so that subsidy per passenger is like $5. So, but the state of Michigan looks at that as a critical corridor to connect 2 major Midwestern cities. Chicago to St. Louis, fares range from $25 to $71. That distance is about 280 miles. The state of Illinois looks at their Amtrak program as a public service program to make it easy, a public service project to make it easy for people to move throughout the state so they keep the fares low and provide a little bit more subsidy. So we're coming into this thinking that the states like Ohio want us to run this as a commercial enterprise, so we're going to charge the fares that the market will bear. And you can charge more fare, the better the service is. So the faster the trains are, the more on time they are, the more you're going to get choice customers, and choice customers will pay more fare. So at Seattle, Eugene, the example that I used, about 280 miles, fare is $58 to $104 in coach, again, depending on the time of year. Business class is $89 to $118. We run a sleeping car train on that corridor. You can get a private room for $351 and not have to even talk to anybody.
Well, we're interested in ensuring that we have access for everyone that can pay all ticket prices. So, make sure that there's plenty for those lower end tickets too.
Well, don't forget you can board a train without having to take your shoes off.
That's true.
There's
For
that.
now.
For now.
I want to thank our panelists very much. This was a fascinating conversation. I hope you agree. And such an important one related to mobility, equity, and economic development, not just locally, but in Ohio in general. And so thank you very much for joining us. Next week, next Wednesday, in CMC's Trends series, we're going to explore how early development in children impacts education once they get to school. And I'll give you a hint, it takes a village. Thanks again to our sponsors today, Tom Daly Foundation, Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Forum, Revisiting Columbus History, and our partner, Columbus Landmarks. Thanks also to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. And finally, thank you for our online virtual seat patrons, and special appreciation again to our speakers, Thea Walsh Ewing, Jeff Darbee, Derek James, and thank you, Andy, for moderating the panel. We could not do this without you. We'll see you again next Wednesday. Hope everybody enjoys the beautiful day. Thank you.